Sex, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the speculative interdimensional vehicle, Sex in Space. Its mission, to explore new points of view, to seek out fresh opinions, to boldly go where so many have gone before, and still somehow manage to totally miss the point. Subscribe to Sex in Space, wherever quality podcasts are found.
Hi there, I'm Toshi and welcome back to Sex in Space. We're here continuing to explore sex across all of its infinite dimensions. I hope everyone out there is doing great. We're thrilled to have you join us today, whether you're here for the first time or you've come with us on interdimensional adventures many times before. Please don't forget to show your support by liking, rating, sharing and subscribing. Your feedback means the world to us. Check out our TikTok and Instagram for more great Sex in Space content. Just search for us using our handle at sexinspace.com. That's Sex in Space, DOTCOM. We always love hearing from our listeners and engaging with our community, so please feel free to reach out in any way you like. Now let's get into a fantastic interview. For this episode, the first installment in our podcast series in collaboration with Intersex Aotearoa, Jane was privileged to speak with Jelly O'Shea. Jelly is a queer Pākehā intersex individual and a dedicated advocate and activist. This conversation is an introduction to what it means to be intersex, touching on history, some of Jelly's own experiences, and highlighting what can be done to contribute to an inclusive society that both embraces and uplifts those who have been historically overlooked or marginalised. Let's jump in.
Thank you so much for joining today. It's really cool to be here with you. We've both been trying to set this up for a while, so it's good. And I guess for those listening, the word intersex is just new and for some people, and they don't even understand what it means. Thank you, education system. So maybe we can start there with just an unpacking of what it means, the term itself.
That's a great place to start. And I think just to honour that there's a reason we don't know. And it is, like you said, it's not within our education system. And it's sort of for the past 100 years in Western medicine been intentionally concealed. So intersex essentially is an umbrella term that describes a vast, beautiful, natural range of the ways that the human body can develop. And those are innate, so those processes are often formed in utero. They can be genetic. They also can just be part of the miraculous process of cells coming together and dividing and chromosomes, manifesting through the process of development. And so what that sort of comes out as is that a bunch of people, we think anywhere from 1.7 to 2.3%, and that's conservative, are born with what we call a variation of sex characteristics. So we all have sex characteristics. Those can be primary. So primary ones talk about your sort of reproductive systems, your hormones, your chromosomes, those vital kind of innate things that helps your body process your hormones and defines whether you develop breasts or you create sperm, all those sorts of things. And then secondary sex characteristics are informed by your primary ones. And so they can be like where hair grows on your body, muscle development, bone density, all that sort of things. So when we talk about someone having an innate variation in their sex characteristics, that's basically saying that people have been born or have developed through puberty a difference or diversity to what's normally understood. And people often say, in the simple answer of what is intersex, that the spiel sort of goes something like, people will be born with differences not commonly seen in male and female bodies or understood as male and female. And I think actually what it does is intersex bodies or variations in sex characteristics gives us a bit of an opportunity to think about the parts of our bodies as being part of sort of a broader way of being, they don't always need to have a sort of a standard or a normal, because we're all affected by these concepts of normal that aren't true. We're all affected by, Western concepts of beauty and trying to live up to those. And, why do I have this funny bit of fat on my back? Or why do I have one breast bigger than the other? And, obviously that's really different to sex characteristics in some senses, but I think we can relate to that. So if you're someone with an innate variation of sex characteristics at birth, it might be visible, and or it might not. So people often think, if they do know a little bit about intersex, that they imagine this baby that's got atypical genitalia. I'm doing air quotations now for the listening audience. Or that some people say ambiguous genitalia.
Yeah.
And so that might mean that it's not the archetype of the hermaphrodite. We don't, it's a falsehood, it's a myth. There are hermaphroditic insects, but humans, it's not actually possible for us to have both sets of genitals. So you can have fusing of like labias that into what may look like a small penis. You can have urethras in different positions. So instead of at the tip of the penis, it could be at the base of the shaft, and actually a myriad of diversities. But it's just one category of intersex, of which there are about 47 at least different variations. And another time of kind of manifestation in the body is through puberty. So someone may or may not go through puberty in a way that would be deemed typical. Mm-hmm. So a young woman might not develop breasts and might not have their period. And so that would be at a point where family members after some time might, go, oh, hey, what's going on? And we'll go to the doctor and find out. And there's a bunch of different reasons why. And one of those is that they may have internal gonads instead of ovaries. And when you think about the gestation process and what happens inside a forming fetus, is that the same sort of tissue mass actually in the development stages in utero goes through a chain reaction depending on what chromosomes split and change, and whether your ovaries drop down to become testicles. And that's so fascinating when we really think about just those like biological realities, that all of us had the same soupy awesome mix to start with, and it was just a series of of chain reactions that resulted in the way that we came together. So and then there's a final stage where lots of people are also come into a diagnostic period where they might be told as adults that they actually have an intersex variation, and that's when they're trying to conceive. So it might appear that for whatever reason there could be an innate variation that means that they don't produce, their body's not being run by testosterone. They actually have really high estrogen, and so they're not able to produce sperm, or like I said, if you were born with gonads instead of ovaries, you're obviously going to have serious challenges when it comes to carrying a child. So there's we think of these three centers of a lifespan where people come into contact with medical diagnostic moments.
Yeah, and as you say, some might never,
exactly.
They might go their whole lives not knowing. So the numbers that we have are, rough but understated in terms of how many people are in this community. And for the listeners, one of the stats I like that gives us some context for the average person trying to get their head around it is as many people in the world as redheads.
Exactly.
And then you go, oh, okay.
Yeah, and we can even bring it locally. For me, it's the same population as people living in Lower Hutt, in Whanganui-a-Tara, Wellington. So, and really conservative numbers. We're talking about there's 80,000 people in Aotearoa, New Zealand right now who have, you know, a variation of some type at least. And so we're trying to reframe that and say, wow, exciting, beautiful, congratulations, I think is the attempt.
I like that reframing. I think that often, you know, I mean, so within the communities of the world, many communities have, they don't have just an either male or female model. They actually have a much more informed understanding of the diversity and beauty and wonderfulness of bodies. And often that's celebrated as, oh, this is special, how cool. It's part of the richness of being human, but this is you know, a really important part of who we are as a community, and we celebrate that, which is wonderful. And I think the important point that you made before, I kind of want to go back to with you, is this is a recent evolution, and it starts with the science community, who, a couple of gentlemen actually responsible for this, kind of came up with the idea of normal, and that's had a cascade effect. Exactly.
Yeah, and I know you're talking with Regina Sterling at some point, and I'm sure they'll go into a more in-depth history. But I think as a sort of introduction, it's easier to just talk about the sort of the modern medical marvel, which was, you know, the sort of turn of the century. We've got surgical techniques advancing with at the First World War and the Second World War. So there was a rampant amount of skills that were developed just through the intensity of sort of wound care and surgical kind of plastic surgery. And that collided with some of the conservatism that we saw post-World War II in the 50s, which was really about, like, let's get back to normal. We've all been through this really traumatic time. Let's get back to these sort of ideas of before, which was actually, you know, if you think of like a Victorian era, things were probably not normal either, but a little bit more in terms of like a very patriarchal state. And through the wars, we know that lots of women actually stepped up massively in their communities and had a lot of independence and had to run a lot of the industries and, you know, take care of the farm and the kids. They did it all. And we had a lot of men coming back from war traumatized, but also trying to reestablish themselves in all these new sort of awkward spaces that had been filled up by their partners and their wives. So I think we can explain some of the 1950s, the sort of nuclear family dynamics, the woman in the kitchen, the happy kids, the brand new vacuum cleaner. I don't know, the sort of like domestic sensibilities.
Instant pudding.
Yeah. Being like, I guess in some ways it could be a trauma response, you know, but this sort of squeaky clean image of being, I think, really was infiltrated into concepts in psychology, which Dr. John Money led in the Johns Hopkins University in the States. And so he was actually I was talking about Lower Hutt. He was from Lower Hutt, and
Oops.
Yep. He's one of our claims to fame, but I think a sad one. He came up with what you're saying, some of these concepts of normal, and that was through experimentation on young intersex people. And actually, there's a famous story about a set of twins who weren't intersex, but one of who had what they call like a botched circumcision. And Dr. John Money was called in, the psychologist, to be able to tell the parents how they were going to basically bring up this young boy who had this, you know, real surgical horror happened. And so he said, aha, well, this is where I can really prove my thesis and say, actually, it's nurture, not nature. So we can raise him as a girl and everything will be fine. And this can also help reinforce my theories, my scientific theories around the approach we should be taking to anyone that presents with atypical body diversity. And so those twins were raised, in a highly sort of a medicalized way, in terms of, they had repeated, tests and psychological tests. They were very they were very watched and documented. And Dr. John Money got to write this amazing thesis and say, what a success. I did it. It's great. And that academic outcomes ended up reinforcing the medical model we still have today. But actually, a good sort of 10 years later, another academic, what's his name? Milton Diamond, I think, Dr. Diamond. He always had suspicions about these theories and was also a sexologist, and actually found that a lot of Dr. John Money's theories were quite sort of like heteronormative and homophobic, and was this sort of reinforcing this concept of like, if we have a queer body, it can turn into a queer mind. So it's actually a way to protect your children from becoming like divergent or deviant or, becoming homosexual, if we make sure that their body is ordered. So Dr. Diamond went in and actually followed up with the twins and the family and found that the young boy who had been raised as a girl had rejected that framing and had ended up re sort of establishing himself as David, and unfortunately has a really sad end, and he ends up taking his life. And so this was exposed, that Dr. John Money actually, his experiment and his theories were not based on true academic sound research, and that he had fabricated some of the results to back up his thesis. But unfortunately, that didn't have a major impact, because by then the protocol that he had helped with others to develop that influenced the medical model was well established, and that is one of that early intervention is best, and that minimal conversation is best. So don't talk to your young ones about it. They won't. The younger they are, the better soft tissue heals, and they won't remember. So this idea that we can change people's bodies in infancy through multiple surgeries that are very complex and often require continuing surgeries through life, that this concept that we could do all of that and that not to have an effect on people, I think is massively debunked, but unfortunately is still ongoing in our hospitals today, in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and throughout the world.
It seems extraordinary that such barbaric practices are anywhere in history that we can recall. And yet, when you look around at the way the world behaves, we're not so very evolved, we humans.
Yes, and I think lots of that we can, like you rightly said, when we look at communities around the world, Indigenous communities, there's histories of special places in society for people with diverse sex characteristics or diverse gender identities. And what we can map is actually a colonial concept of normal, that goes way back before the 1950s. It actually goes into like the doctrine of discovery and this idea of the Western white body being the body that everyone should aspire to, and there's the stepping stones in that colonial approach to enslavement, and the sort of the colonial approach of everything from land dispossession and cultural destruction. Lots of that massively is also intertwined with like concepts of grandeur about the European ways of being, and enforcing those on Indigenous people, and also on its own constituents. So we all feel the effects of that in the way that healthcare works, and the way that systems prioritize some bodies over others, and that there's rampant privileges that we see in the health outcomes in this country still that are very well documented and mapped, that Māori and Pacific Islanders are not treated the same way within our health institutions. And we also know that there's not what they call health literacy. People don't know how to talk about this. We don't have the language to talk about sex characteristics, being diverse. We don't have the words. And so if young parents or parents are being presented with this as a medical emergency, which is the culture, you've got a healthy baby, but there is like a genetic variance that is concerning. We can fix it. We can, if we operate now, we can help your baby boy to be healthy and well. And so what parent would say no to that? And so we talk about a lot, a lack of informed consent. Sometimes parents are vilified for the decisions that they make. And that's obviously affects whānau and family relations. But I look at a culture of the lack of education actually being a process of harm in itself, because we can't make informed decisions about something that we've never heard about. It would be like saying you've got a healthy baby, your baby's actually a unicorn, but don't worry, we can fix it. And then
we'll take the horn off.
Yeah, we'll take the horn off.
No more unicorn.
We don't have words to say, sorry, can you slow down? Actually, I don't really understand what you're talking about, and I'd like to get a second opinion. We're not given, we don't necessarily practice that unless you're shown how to do that. There's actually, a lot of hierarchy and intimidation that happens within medical settings where we aren't given agency to understand our bodies enough to really say, oh, I might go home and think about that. Most people are presented with this sort of fear, risk framing around, here's a bad situation, but we can make it good. What a relief.
We defer often to the authority or that power that those people have, doctors, surgeons, they give some information and you take that information as truth.
Yes. And I mean, those same practitioners are doing the best they can. I don't think that they sit at home and think, oh, I can't wait to do all these surgical interventions on young people today. They genuinely, with the tools that they've been given and with the bias and the sort of heteronormativity, the sort of concept of what wellness is, what a functioning person in society is, there's lots of pressure for surgeons to be the ones that are fixing the problem, the perceived problem, rather than actually being a social issue about how we look at people and look at normal and look at sort of concepts around, fertility and being able to have heteronormative sex. Those things are actually what's ruling the surgical interventions. And that's why, it's often really shameful for adults who get coerced into surgical interventions, because they think, well, the language we use about, young people who literally don't have voice can't say, 6 months old or 3 years old or whatever it is, I don't want this to happen. There's a lot of shame for adults who are coerced into surgery once diagnosis is made, because they think, well, I can speak and I didn't say no. And that's where you've really got to bring in the fact that if we've never heard about something before and it gets presented to you in a situation where you already are not confident, you don't know, you don't understand the words that someone's saying to you, and there's that, what you were saying, Jane, about, a sense of authority and us bending to it, that is a recipe for passiveness and compliance, and also trust. Of course, I want the best for me. I want to be well and healthy. And so I think that's sort of the challenge, is actually for us to unpack some of those biases and some of those ideas of normal from the very core of our institutions and our thinking. And until that happens, we'll continue to have these really discordant conversations between people within the healthcare sector and people like me who have survived multiple surgeries without my informed consent, and now can understand so much through my own access to information as an adult and finding community members. I sort of can understand and see it all. I can see the matrix, the lattice of the sort of medical industrial complex, all sorts of ways that it's talked about. But, that's a long, hard journey, because, again, there's not language. It's not talked about in sex education. It's not talked about even at university levels, unless you do like genetic biology at a high level. And it's not talked about in medical training. No. I think there's sometimes there's a short 2-hour class, but also if you go to that one, you'll miss out on the one on diabetes. So, right. and what you might be learning is that there's a bunch of congenital disorders, and here's the treatment pathway, and it is recommended surgeries. And these are the surgeries that are recommended.
And that's the problem, isn't it? Because it's been firmly framed as a problem that needs treatment. Yes. Rather than part of the normal diversity of humanness, if I use the word normal in a different way.
Yeah, well, we can reclaim that word, absolutely.
We do, but gosh, there's a lot riding on that one. But
yes, and that's relative, isn't it?
Yes, and it seems like the most important takeaway for anybody listening is to understand that being intersex is just part of the normalness of being human, and it's not a problem to be solved. Exactly. And education is absolutely critical at all levels.
Yes,
to move forward.
Education is harm reduction in this context, and peeling off. There's sort of big words that we end up using as activists, and I rally against trying to use them, but sometimes they're just helpful. But sort of peeling off that pathologization, and by that I mean those ideas that have been layered over eons of the concept of a healthy, beautiful, desirable body, or the concept of a functional body. We're not talking about your organs working properly. Actually, I wish we were, because lots of our variations come with a bunch of genuine health concerns. Very little of them are life-threatening, but we do deserve and need appropriate health care. That is not what we're receiving. We're receiving sort of interventions that are aesthetic, that are, and by that I mean they're very invasive, but they're about passing as a heteronormative woman or a heteronormative man. And I think it's really important for me to say that the majority of people with an intersex variation do identify as heterosexual and as male or female. So it doesn't mean that you're not male or female. And we have the same stats within our population of people that identify as trans and non-binary. And so just to sort of place that in people's minds, an easy way to think about it is that we all have like sexual orientation. We all have a gender identity or expression, how you relate to sort of yourself in the world or how others may relate to you, though I think that's less important, really. I think it's more about how we relate to ourselves in the world. And then the third one is we all have sex characteristics. And we're not taught this again. We're not taught about these like different ways of thinking about, these are all relational things, right? How we relate to each other, how we relate to ourselves. They're jumbled up, and they're jumbled up because the systems of categorization we use, so when on your passport, how you move through space, how you're identified, is not by the mole on your cheek or the your parent, or like there's lots of different ways we could classify people, but we classify people with these concepts of like sex or sex at birth, or often these days it's gender by default. So what gender are you? But these two words, sex and gender, have been used irreplaceably, so they've been conflated. And so again, this is a very Western way of talking about it, and it's not an Indigenous way of talking about it. And in Te Ao Māori and in parts of the Pacific, these would, the way that this would be discussed would be really different. But just to sort of give people a something to ground down into where sex characteristics sits, it is separate from, the way that you perceive yourself as male or female or non-binary or trans.
It's, for a lot of people, thinking about my parents' generation, there's just so little vocabulary to kind of even start to have conversations around this subject. And yet, once you dig a little, there's so much insight and understanding through lived experiences.
Yes.
Because this isn't new, right?
No.
This has previously been part of who we are and what we are. And it's the auntie, the friend, the cousin. And then their stories reveal that, oh, right, so this is actually, it just wasn't talked about. As you said, It's been deliberately made invisible.
Yes.
Through the kind of dominant medical model, but actually it's about reclaiming visibility as well and saying this is just part of.
Yeah, and I think it's really important to think about privacy versus concealment when we talk about this, because like it is uncomfortable. There's probably reasons why it's taboo, right? But I think we have to think about it in terms of like, I have the same right that you have to not be asked about your genitals or to have invasive questions about your body asked. But I also have the right to tell people who I feel comfortable with about the fact that I was born with a variation of sex characteristics. And that means for me, what the word that's comfortable for me is intersex. It's not for everyone. Some people really don't like that word, and we could talk about that a little bit more in a minute. But and so that's about my choice and my consent, my privacy. What's different is when we talk about concealment, that's super different. So that's like if, I wasn't told and then I had to find out as an adult that not only is my body different from everyone else's, but that all these things had happened. And, that's very discordant for people.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so do you remember when, if you're okay to even go here, because lightly from my end, but do you remember when you first became aware of the difference and the need for a term or a framing from your perspective?
Well, yeah, it was really interesting because I was always hanging out in rainbow spaces. I'm a queer person as well, so and I'm an artist, so I think like there's some privilege in the fact that I was already in like, what some people call counterculture, or like already at the edge of things. And my partner was trans, and I was still very medically I was like shamed about my body, and it was this thing that I didn't talk about. And when I did like have to talk about it with, you know, lovers or something, it would be like this really emotional sort of like vomit of words that were like medical words, and I didn't really know how to talk about it, and it would be like very awkward. And but it would also be very like hidden within the recesses of myself, you know. And I was in a lot of emotional pain, but didn't, like we already discussed, didn't have language to talk about it, but also didn't feel like it was valid to talk about. And so I was supporting my partner who was trans through their own journey, and didn't, you know, and really was like, this is really important. And actually there's all this like, you know, social stigma around being trans, and trying to support them to access gender affirming healthcare. And this is like probably like 18 years ago or something. You know, it was really difficult and quite upsetting a lot of the times. And he dragged me along to this talk by Dr. Diamond in Wellington.
Oh, okay, the Dr. Diamond.
And Dr. Diamond was going through all this stuff, doing a big presentation. And then suddenly he had this whole section on all these different types of like ambiguous genitalia, and he was talking about all these different ways that bodies could come together. And I suddenly like whacked my partner on the chest and was like, that's my thing. Just this one slide came up, and, you know, I was in my early mid-20s by then, you know, and I was so excited. And, you know, I'd gone to the library and tried to look it up in like a medical textbook or something before, but like this was kind of like awkward pre-internet times. So it's not like I could just Google it. And so I had that little moment, but I was still so locked in this kind of place that I was like, it was like gleeful, but it was still secretive. It was like, oh yeah, I've got this thing, this cool person who's done all this research about, you know, gender diversity and sex diversity, talked about this thing I have. I can't remember if he used intersex at all. I don't think so. He might have, but another framing sexologists often use is disorders of sex development. So it's not that snappy.
Well, and also disorder.
Yeah, exactly.
Immediately doing it.
Sort of like,
It's not helpful.
So it took actually another partner years later who was just like a proactive, awesome person who was just like, babe, I'm looking this up, like, and let's get you some cool doctors, and let's like, I'm going to support you to actually find out about what's going on in your body. And like, you know, I'd already been through heaps of medicalization, but I had never actually had things sat down and explained to me. So we requested all my medical records, and I found a really great GP, and we went on a bit of a journey, and I was able to like be like, what does this mean? What does this mean? And that was really empowering. And then I heard about Marnie Bruce Mitchell, and I worked at Trade Aid at the time, and Marnie would come in and buy chocolate, and they're, you know, an infamous character. So they're quite like well recognizable. They'd come and buy chocolate or tea or something, and I'd always be like absolutely like frozen. It would be my least smooth retail delivery. And I ended up finding out that they were a counsellor as well as being intersex. So I had some sort of link there around language, and I emailed them and was like, hey, I think I'm one of you, you know. And even then it wasn't till years later that I actually started getting involved in activism. So when I meet people, I was really lucky to just go on to a retreat in Canberra, because I'm a member of Intersex Peer Support Australia /Aotearoa. And every year, well, this is the first one since COVID actually, they have a retreat where they hire out a sort of a scout camp or some large sort of retreat. and people from all over, predominantly Australia, but also Aotearoa go, and it gets funded, and so it's really supportive for people to be there. And it's really common for people in their 50s, and up, for it to be their first time that they've ever met anyone else with an intersex variation. And it's extremely powerful and extremely full of grief time for people, because there's been so much secrecy in people's lives, to the point where people haven't even told their own partners. They have avoid having relationships at all their entire life because they're so ashamed of their body being different. They never possibly could go to a swimming pool or couldn't play sport, couldn't do all these things because they had to hide their body at all costs. And, that sort of implies that what would be revealed would be this monstrous thing. It's not even that. It's just that we are told to hold so much shame that becomes the monstrous thing. That's the heavy thing, not the ways that our bodies are different. So what happens at these retreats is amazing and powerful and so cool. We do everything from like dance workshops and sharing circles, and also just like go on cool adventures or have rest time, or this time we did karaoke, we did a talent show. There was a good like nearly 30 people there of all ages, of all like ethnic diversities, just every beautiful kind of melting pot. People that like, you'd never meet normally in your day-to-day life, and suddenly we're bound by this often really difficult experiences is what brings us together, this commonality of going through that medical model and being alone with it, and our parents not having the language to talk to us about it, our partners not understanding or even knowing how to support us, and that being locked away somewhere. And so something really magic happens when we come together, and that's essentially what I'm really passionate about now, and what I'd love to bring more to Aotearoa New Zealand, to think that in nearly 2024 we still haven't had a peer support program up and running in Aotearoa for people that's accessible and people can confidentially reach out. It's really been lacking. And, there's lots of reasons why that's been difficult, underfunding, but also just the majority of even funders being uneducated, and people getting really confused about where it sits. People being like, we don't fund rainbow organisations, and for us to be like, well, we're the I in the LGBTQIA plus, but actually the majority of people with intersex variations don't identify with the rainbow, and so where does that leave them? So I think there's lots of reasons why it's been difficult, but that's not a reason for us not to try. And so hopefully you'll see and hear more of this coming together that I think is really, really vital to our healing, but also empowering the broader circles around us, our whānau, our partners, our communities, to be more literate in how to talk about this stuff. And hopefully through that we can see a wave of change.
Absolutely. And I think for any parents out there who are facing into this right now, or anybody who's been trapped in this space, there are now places you can get some support from, and definitely within your country, because we have people tuning in from very different places, but most countries now offer support groups and resources. And get literate. Don't let anybody bully you into anything. And shame is it belongs with people who should know better and get educated. In the medical system, not with anybody outside it. Get literate. And activism is literacy in this instance, at least if nothing else, get literate.
Yeah. And I think it's really important to just like make a quick note on that language piece that I was talking about earlier is if you don't relate to the word intersex, because intersex has been sort of muddied into this like we actually hear from we hear about young people who have a variation of sex characteristics that don't want to come to the organisation Intersex Aotearoa because they've been told or they've heard that intersex means that you can't be male or female. And that's totally not true and is a real disservice and misinformation that can actually come from the medical institution. So if you're going through a diagnostic process, you'll never hear the word intersex. You'll hear that you have congenital injuries, your hyperplasia, or, another sort of like complex term. I can't even like say my full variation. That, I'm like, there's 4 different names of old white men, Yeah. So I think language is really important, and language has been a massive barrier. So if you don't connect to intersex, that is absolutely fine, totally, but don't let that be this thing that stops you from connecting to other people because, there's people that we support that, use the language of DSD because that's the only tool that they've been given, or they only use the language of their particular variation. Or, more and more people are starting to use VSC, the variations in sex characteristics, so it's a bit awkward and
it's quite a mouthful.
Quite a mouthful, but language is power. Language is a connector. Language is how we bring community together. So just remember that there's things that seem like blocker barriers in the way. Don't let that be the reason that you don't connect to someone else, because honestly, it is so powerful. You really, really genuinely, you might have nothing in common with this person, but there's a bond. There's an amazing bond and just a sense of like lightening and just laying down a lot of those heavy weights of isolation, shame and secrecy.
Loneliness.
Yeah, and you can still be totally private about it. You don't have to become an activist. Please don't. It's pretty exhausting, to be honest. But, you can still be really private, but we all need spaces to talk about stuff, no matter what it is, but especially something like this that people might be carrying for a very long time.
Yeah, peer support isn't well understood, I don't think, outside maybe the spaces in which it's active and it's a thing you do.
Yes.
A really nice example of that was my partner is a type 1 diabetic, and I introduced them to a childhood friend who was type 1 diabetic. And it was the first other diabetic that my childhood friend had spoken to ever.
Wow.
Basically because he was diagnosed very young, 30 years of alone.
Yeah.
Never having a conversation with somebody else who has it.
Apart from a doctor, I imagine.
And they didn't have it.
Yeah.
And
yes, of course, yes.
It was an extraordinary moment for him to feel a sense of connection and to be able to share the experience of, so that and that, and it was like this and that, and it was this kind of torrent of just meeting another human with the same experience. And that's what's so powerful. It doesn't mean you have to be the same. They're very different people.
Exactly.
It just means that you feel not so alone.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a common thing, like I've met intersex activists from Zimbabwe, from Colombia, from, the Middle East. And there's this narrative that we're often told at the moment of diagnosis of you have a really rare condition. It's, maybe 1 in 2,000 people. You'll probably never meet someone like you. It doesn't matter what the variation is that someone has. No. We're all given these stats. And so I think the thing that the term intersex does for us is that we talk about 47 different variations. So if you look at it like that, each individually, yes, they may be quite rare. But also when you put them together and give them an umbrella term, suddenly we get those stats of like, oh, hey, wait, we're looking at like, 2.3% of the population, the same amount of people that have red hair. Mm-hmm. wait a minute, that means that there's someone down the road that you know, like I've literally had someone be told that they'll never meet someone like them, and then years later finding out not only their like old childhood friend was intersex, but also had the same variation as them, which is pretty bonkers. That's pretty amazing. And they'd been living in these states of like aloneness and pain. I think they even they were like treated by the same doctor. So when they did finally get to talk about it, you know, those like frustrations that they've experienced, the sort of all the highs and the lows just become tumbling out. And it's like, yeah, like you were saying, just to have that connectivity with someone who totally gets it, and you don't have to over-explain things and really stress points and go back to, well, in 1982 when I was born, you know, you get to just kind of, you know, start at a intermediate advanced level and it all comes spilling out. And sometimes we just need to be messy and let it all out, you know. We can't always be sort of high functioning, tucked away with the challenges in our lives. Some days you can, and that's awesome. But for many of us who have gone through medicalisation, and even those that have had supportive families and have been able to not go through surgical interventions, they still live in a world where they're told that they're not normal. So that sort of level of support is still really vital.
Absolutely. Yeah. Is there anything that this has been such a great conversation, and I guess the other thing I'd say before I ask the next question is, for any parents listening, part of what you can do is not only get educated, but educate your kiddies growing up that this is just part of humanness. Fill the gap. At the moment, you know, a lot of the work that we do at Sex in Space is about trying to find ways to fill the gaps that education, sadly, isn't going to get to. So get in there, you know, and look for books that explain it in a way that's really helpful for children.
Yes.
Read those books with them, you know, just get stuck in. And again, that's a form of activism that can really make a difference.
Yeah, I really agree. Just lifting that veil of stigma. I think the saddest thing to realize is that when parents unknowingly agree to things that could be painful for us later in life, and or don't talk about them with us, like don't talk about our differences at all, because it's awkward, and you know, lots of parents don't have the language and they want to respect their kids' privacy, and that can be a hard balance. Or the kid doesn't want to talk about it, like, there's still a way that tells us, if we don't talk about it or that things have to be fixed, that we were actually broken in the first place. And so I think no matter what choices have been made, you know, to also acknowledge and accept that and move forward together with as much transparency and celebration and sort of like strength-based language as possible, and that parents deserve peer support so much, and there's a network of amazing parents in Aotearoa and I'm sure around the world as well that you could access through different intersex organisations. And those parents are active at sharing information, at like linking each other with great, you know, medical practitioners. Don't do it alone. Don't be so ashamed that you can't tell your family and friends what's going on for your kid, but do respect your kid's privacy. So again, it's theirs to choose whether they talk about it or not, and they might not want to talk about it. They might genuinely not want to share that with other people, and that's all good. Or they might be like in the playground being like, guess what? I was born with internal gonads, you know, like, you know, some kids are just out there being like, I'm not going to have kids, but mum said I might adopt, or, you know, whatever it is.
Yeah.
You know, we see examples of it all the time where kids are given agency and language, and then they can decide, you know, and they can also learn about the preciousness of their story and that, you know, how they give it out or how they choose to hold it. that's an important lesson for all of us, I think, of negotiating the private versus the sort of empowerment. But yeah, please don't do it alone, and don't feel like the only information you can get is through the healthcare sector. And there's lots of amazing work that's happened in Aotearoa. There's one website called, I think it's www.vsc.org, and that's by Professor Dr. Denise Steers, doctor, who did her PhD, where she worked directly with parents, young people, and medical practitioners to look at the ways that people are talking or not talking about it, and ways that could improve. So she's got a great booklet that is for not just parents, but actually for parents and doctors to work through together to help guide those conversations and to talk about taking space and taking time around decision making, and also empowering your child to feel fantastic and awesome as they are. And in fact, in my opinion, even cooler than anyone else, because it is essentially like a superpower. So yeah, there's a great word coined by amazing activist Bonnie Hart in Australia, and she always talks about intersexy. So, the glow up version of us is intersexy, and that we're always working towards intersexy land. And, intersexy land is a utopia of celebration and love and support for, that diversity that is just bang up.
I love that word.
Normal nature stuff, You look at plants, you look at animals, you look at human bodies, we're all doing it.
Absolutely. And I think again, that call out for parents, people anyway listening, but also parents who aren't dealing with this. It's that educate yourselves, because when the kid gets to the playground and goes, hey, guess what? For other kids to go, oh yeah, I heard about that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Yes, I love that. Yeah, we want to be at the point where we're like, oh yeah, cool, fist pump. That's cool.
Exactly.
Oh, I think my cousin has that too. Awesome.
Yeah, although a slight sort of whiff of envy for being intersexual.
Yes. Be like, can I come to your birthday party?
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I always say, just have conversations, even if it's awkward, work it out. Like, kids are so cool about this stuff. They become less cool as they become aware of what people around them are saying, and that sort of like indoctrination about sexual diversity, gender expression and sex characteristics as they stumble into this world of like misogyny and all these norms that tell us we've got to be a certain way. You see a tightening of those, muscles that at a young age are really open and just like cool about a bunch of stuff. So that might put fear into some people's knee joints. That's into sexy land, and that's where it should be.
Absolutely. I think that's a really good note to finish on. But as always, I'll ask, is there anything we haven't talked about that you think is really important to touch base about or cover off? Because you might have something in your head that we didn't cover.
I think just to talk about the Aotearoa context, and just that, really stress that my experiences as like a Pākehā person, and that really informs the work that I do, and that there's so much work that Pākehā or white activists in this space need to do to let in other voices, and for there to be space and time for Indigenous ways of being in the world. And sometimes that can counter some of the narratives that are being used by intersex activists globally around sort of like, at the United Nations level of like legal speak and bringing change and bringing legislation and bringing kind of, that real meeting doctors with their language, being able to be understood and respected at a clinical level, some of that can really jar with Indigenous ways of being. And so I think just naming that there can't be one right way for this to be for people, and that's on a sort of micro level, individual to individual, that everyone gets to narrate their own experience and use whatever language they want and speak to that in whatever way that they want. And there's some ways that can be helpful in terms of like educating a broader community, and there's some ways that can just be like specific to that person, but doesn't mean that that's what intersex means, if you know what I'm saying. I think we need space for there to be commonalities so that it benefits the broader understanding around education. And then we also need to make space for, Indigenous ways of knowing and being that are being reclaimed after that sort of colonial dampening or kind of enforced destruction and knowledge. So, I'm really always passionate and intrigued and awkward about that and all the ways that I should be, in terms of how to make space, how to do that in a way that's supportive and not continuing to sort of perpetuate some of those colonial ways of being. So I think just a call out to sort of others in this movement that might have voices of authority and a sense of sort of the right ways of being, and that we need to practice what we preach a little bit. And we talk about embracing diversity, and I think we need to do that as a movement as well.
Yeah, I think that's a very wise and humble comment. Thank you for that.
Cool.
Well, a great pleasure and a privilege, and what a fantastic conversation. I feel like I had other questions, like a big list, and we've sort of kind of gone in this space, and I love it. It's been amazing. So thank you so much.
My absolute pleasure.
We really hope you enjoyed this episode. To learn more, you can check out intersexaotearoa.org. Before we sign off, we want to remind you that both of our books, How to Talk with Your Kids About Porn and The Organ Education Forgot, are now available as both a downloadable PDF and a physical copy, so you can read them in whichever format you prefer. Head over to sexandspace.com to grab yourself a copy. Please make sure to leave a like, follow, comment, share, or review wherever you're tuning in from. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. Until next time, safe travels and see you on the next episode.